Get started. First of all, I am Dr. William Behun. I am the Primate for the United States of America for the Apostolic Johannite Church. And I've been told that I am talking about magic and the liturgy. And this seems appropriate considering the sort of emphasis of this year's conclave in Portland, Oregon, because we're looking particularly at some of the more esoteric aspects of AJC practice. And we are, at the end of the day, an esoteric church. Not in the sense that we are hidden or secret, or we don't have public services, or we don't let people in, or anything like that. But there's always an esoteric mindset to the work that we do. This is more than just, as we say, waving the magic Gnosticizer over traditional liturgies or something like that. That's been a tradition in a lot of the Gnostic churches, at least for 100 years. You simply take something like the Catholic liturgy and you change a couple of the words and you insert a prayer to the Sophia and, voila, you've got a Gnostic Mass. Instead, we've actually begun to change not just the terminology and the imagery in our liturgy, but also to try to change the mindset of how we approach the liturgy. So we can, at one and the same time, give esoteric readings to traditional aspects of the liturgy, but also to incorporate the esoteric work into our liturgical practice. So we change the perspective and the rite. Those of you who are familiar with the liturgical practice of the Apostolic Johannite Church know that we have a total of 7 different forms of our liturgy, but there are 2 primary forms, which are the what used to be called the congregational rite, and probably still is referred to that in some quarters, but also the Ecclesian form. And the Ecclesian form is my preferred form of the liturgy, and in many ways it is perhaps more explicitly esoteric. Now, that leaves 5 other forms, 4 of which I think arguably are even more magically or esoterically oriented. They involve certain kinds of conjurations and so on and so forth that we don't see in the other forms of the liturgy. The Ecclesian rite does have, in many senses, a sort of ceremonial basis to it in terms of Western ceremonial magical practice. In fact, visiting deacon who was working closely with the church down in Australia, the first time she saw the Ecclesian rite, commented that it felt like ceremonial magic. And I took that as high praise. There are a lot of different aspects of the Ecclesian rite that have a magical sort of moment behind them. Concerning things, for example, like creating a magical space. If you're familiar with the Ecclesian rite, it uses 2 very separate spaces. One, which is the altar of the sacred flame, the other is the altar of the Eucharist. And the celebrant will pass from one to the other, sort of about midway through the liturgy. And it is like passing through the iconostasis in the Orthodox practice. And so it's important to form these magical spaces in the appropriate way so that they can do the work that they're set out to do. And creating a magical space is an important part of any kind of magical practice. Of course, we just had a wonderful talk by Monsignor Scott Rosbach about the friary. And the friary is an explicitly magical body that is associated with the Apostolic Johannite Church. And there are aspects of our liturgical practice that come out of the friary. So there is always a kind of blending of the esoteric and the exoteric within our public and private practice. In some sense, the liturgy itself can be understood as a single magical act, a single magical ritual. especially if we think about magic as a transformative act, as a way of transforming the individual and forming a community, an egregore, to bring the individual more closely in contact with the divine, which is to say it is a practice of theurgy. That theurgical practice suffuses everything that is part of the liturgy. And nothing should be included in the liturgy that doesn't ultimately serve that theurgical purpose. Magic and liturgical practice have always been deeply connected. In fact, if you look at a lot of the medieval or Renaissance grimoires, many of them assume that the operator is an ordained priest. So there are aspects of those ceremonies that rely on the initiation of ordination. Also, when we look at the late 19th and into the 20th and 21st century churches that are most closely aligned with the esoteric tradition, we see close connections between bodies that have a mystical, magical, or esoteric orientation paired with more exoteric church organizations. So, for example, the Douanel Gnostic Church ultimately became associated with Martinism, and in fact, for a period, officially so. We see the connection between OTO and the EGC. So, within the tradition as it's developed in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, there is this twin aspect. So it makes a certain amount of sense that there would be this kind of connection for the AJC as well. One of the most important sort of magical works that the AJC does is the sacraments. And I do consider the sacraments to be magical operations in their own right. In some cases, they are initiatory. Baptism and confirmation, in particular, have an initiatory context. And of course, holy orders have an initiatory content as well. If you read some of the work of René Guénon, he talks explicitly about the way in which, in the exoteric churches, the initiatory character has been lost. But we would hope to preserve some of that in the context of our own work. Sacraments are always preferably done in the context of a liturgy. So there is also this connection as well. My goal today is to, rather than moving through the liturgy and pointing out sort of the magical aspects for each section, to look at different forms of magical practice and identify some of the aspects of the liturgy that might fit into those categories. In some cases, things are going to fit into more than one category. I'm going to point out that there are a couple of categories that are left out. There are probably some that I haven't considered. But the ones that I want to focus on are these: purification, consecration, banishing. Right? That's one. Invocation, evocation, or conjuring, another. Talisman creation, or the charging of physical objects. Alchemy or transmutation, devotional or specifically theurgical work, therapeutic work, and lastly, initiation itself. So you see right off the bat, there are a couple of things that are missing from this. Number one is divination. There is no explicit divination within the context of the liturgy, which is not to say that it would be out of place. For example, to do a sort of bibliomancy within the context of the liturgy, but that would be something that would be added in. That would be a secondary addition. It's not an explicit part of the ritual. And the other part is thaumaturgy, is wonder working, which is not an explicit part of our liturgy. And as I said, there may be other aspects of magical practice that I'm not including here, but I think that these are some of the most important. So to begin with purification, consecration, and banishing. The point of this is, in many ways, to create a sacred space or to dedicate tools to a particular purpose or use. Often, this is related to invocation, evocation, conjuring, as it's often seen as a necessary precondition for the summoning of spirits, which, of course, we're not allowed to do here. So often it's part of the same rituals. When we dedicate a space, or we dedicate a particular object to a use, we set it aside from ordinary use and ordinary practice in order to make it special for a particular magical act. So in traditional ceremonial magic, or goitia, you see the consecration of the tools of the art. And this can sometimes be taken to absurd extremes. So you have the magic spoon of the art, or the magic lead pencil of the art, or the magic college-lined notebook of art, right? But on some level, you ought to be consecrating every single object that you're going to be using in order to affect any kind of magical change or transmutation to that particular act. So that's not the thing that you use in your everyday life. So you don't use the teaspoon that you use to measure out your sugar to also administer the Eucharist. So there is a magical act that takes place in which we specifically dedicate objects and spaces to their esoteric use. Explicitly, we see this in the asperges, in the purification of the liturgical space by the sprinkling of holy water. In the Theocletian Rite, this happens twice. There are particular moments where both the chamber, right, the church or the nave, whatever space we're working in, is purified with water. The congregation is purified with water, and the altars are purified with water as well. Almost always, purification is followed by consecration. Purification takes place with water, consecration by fire. And normally this is using incense. And incense is used extensively and copiously in AJC rituals in most cases. And again, there are two separate censings in the Theocletian form that consecrate either particular objects or the space in general to the work that we're going to be doing there. We're getting the drum beats. There is in both forms of the liturgy, the ritual that involves, or sort of mini ritual or sub-ritual, that involves the use of the sacred flame itself. And this explicitly is a kind of magical operation. I'm going to steal my text here for just a second, where the celebrant takes the sacred flame and says, "I am come to cast fire on the earth, and what will I but that it be kindled?" And then moves the candle in the 6 directions of space in order to create a magical environment in which the liturgy can take place. From the portal of earth to the portal of fire, from the portal of air to the portal of water, from the center of power to the encompassing adamant, let this sanctuary be established within the sacred flame. There is, I think, no more explicit dedication of the space within the liturgy than this particular moment, where the sacred flame envelops and forms the boundaries of the magical space in which we're going to be working. But we also see other kinds of purifications, for example, the lavabo, the washing of the celebrant's hands, right, to represent the kind of purity that's necessary in order to effect certain kinds of magical changes. The Eucharist itself involves a kind of consecration. Prayers over the gifts are a way of saying that these are special, these are set aside. These are not just, a loaf of Wonder Bread and a jug of wine, right? That these are the elements that are going to be part of a magical operation in which these are transformed in order to transform the community. In the Theocletian Rite, as I mentioned, there is the explicit creation of 2 separate spaces that are each dedicated to a different kind of work. In the Western tradition, we often talk about the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. And this is echoed in the Theocletian form in that the first part of the liturgy takes place within the context of the altar of the sacred flame. in which the Holy Scripture is set, guarded by a sword. This is going to involve the collect, the reading of the lesson, and the intonation of the gospel. So it very much echoes this liturgy of the word. But once that is concluded, the celebrant will turn and enter into a very different space in which he or she will confect the Eucharist. And that particular magical act takes place set aside in a very real way. The celebrant turns his or her back on the congregation in order to work with them, in order to work as a group to create this new product, this new object that we're going to call the Eucharist. In some sense, this echoes the use of the iconostasis in Orthodox practice, where the Eucharist is confected in literally a separate space, a separate kind of room that's set aside from the other aspects of the liturgy. So there are these aspects of purification, of consecration, of creating a sacred space that echo some of the practices of banishing in order to make sure that the space is appropriate for the work that we're going to do. This is often followed in traditional ceremonial magical practice with the invocation, evocation, or conjuring. Now, I'm not going to go into the difference between these three. That is a topic that we could spend the rest of conclave sort of hashing out and never really come to any agreement. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to treat those three as roughly equal. Jake Stratton Kent commented to me once that all magic is conjuration. And I think that there is some truth to this, that we don't do anything without an appeal to some sort of power beyond or greater than or within ourselves. And the most explicit magical acts within our liturgy are the summoning of the archangels. This, as I said, is something that comes from the friary and connects directly from the AJC liturgy to the friary lodge operations. The invocation of the archangels both summons an angelic presence into the space, but also in that sense marks off that space as special. For me, and His Eminence and I have discussed this at enormous length, the moment of transformation, the moment in which the bread and wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ, takes place with the invocation of the Holy Spirit, with the epiclesis. And this too, I think, is very explicit in the Theocletian form, though I think implicit in the other forms of the liturgy. The epiclesis is a specific invocation of the Holy Spirit into or upon the gifts in order to effect the transformation from the ordinary elements of bread and wine into the mystical elements of the body and blood of God. And so we see this as a real magical operation in the heart of the liturgy. Of course, at the end of the liturgy is the license to depart, the thanksgiving to the angelic presences that have watched over what we're doing in this sacred space, and the farewell to them as they return to their own abodes. So we see explicit invocations or avocations or conjuring of angelic presences within the context of the liturgy. But when we talk about the way in which the Eucharistic elements are transformed, we're looking at really a kind of talisman creation, or the charging of an object. And I think of this in terms of the sort of structure set forth by Franciszek Bardon, when he talked about the power of using the magnetic or electric fluids in order to imbue certain kinds of objects with magical power. And again, to reference Monsignor Scott's talk earlier today, the use of crystals in order to store up what we might call magical energy. or fluid or power or whatever terminology you want to use, right, in order to make use of that in accordance with our own particular wills. It uses these objects as a sort of battery that stores up power so that it can be used for various different kinds of operations. And a talisman functions in this way. The talisman is particularly constructed in order to contain a certain kind of force. And then that force is stored up in that physical object. And there are operations that I'm familiar with that use the consecrated host as the basis for talismanic work. But even setting that aside, the very dedication of the Eucharistic bread and wine is a kind of charging of those things with energy. And this is the main point of the Eucharistic sacrifice, that this is how the Eucharist itself works. As I mentioned before, the prayer over the gifts, I think, is a way in which we take the energy that is brought forward in the coming together of a community, and we pour that energy into these objects so that they become suffused with it, so that when they are consumed, that energy returns to us, magnified, amplified, brought to a higher level. And so for me, this seems very, very similar to the kinds of operations that we see in the charging of talismans or the charging of objects with the magnetic or electric fluid. Of course, this Eucharistic operation is alchemical or transformative. It takes a material object and transforms it into something that is qualitatively different. It's not quantitatively different, it's not measurably different. The bread and the wine are still visibly bread and wine. But they're brought to a higher level through a kind of magical transformation that changes the content of the Eucharist itself so that through its consumption, through its administration, it can in turn transform the members of the congregation. The words of institution are often seen as the moment when that happens. In the Eastern tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, it's the epiclesis. But no matter what the particular details of that may be, there is a moment in which there is a transformation that takes place on the most subtle levels. And I think that the liturgy ultimately is focused on that particular magical operation in which, through the effort of the will of the celebrant and the community combined, those elements are transmuted, are transformed. And it's hard for me to imagine anything that would be more magical than this particular operation. Of course, devotional or theurgical work, as I said, is at the heart of AJC practice. And at the end of the day, more than a community of belief, the AJC is a community of practice. To my students in my professional life, teaching philosophy, I talk extensively about the distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy always go hand in hand within any faith community and faith tradition. There's always both of them at stake. But the emphasis shifts from community to community and over time. For example, if we look at Greek pagan practice, the emphasis was squarely on orthopraxy, on doing the kinds of things that demonstrated that you were a committed member of the cult. So when we look at Socrates being accused of impiety, what he's being accused of is not so much having the wrong beliefs as not doing the things that would be indicative of a faithfulness to the community. And that's why this is ultimately a political issue as much as a religious one. When we move into the Christian tradition, the emphasis is much more on orthodoxy, on having the right beliefs. And in some sense, this is explicit within the fourth gospel. He who believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. It tells us what's necessary for salvation is belief. So there's always a little bit of both, but the emphasis shifts dramatically. In the AJC, at least as I've experienced over my time working with these communities, the emphasis is on orthopraxy again. So returning to that original form of faith commitment. So when we look at this shared practice, a lot of it has to do with the kinds of devotional or theurgical work that we wouldn't normally associate with magic, at least in a thaumaturgic sense. That this is a much more subtle or even mystical kind of way of doing things. Bhakti yoga, for example, uses the forms of devotion in order to effect magical change. In the contemplative form of the AJC liturgy, we see this section of Lectio Divina in the middle of the liturgy that really seems to me to be a kind of devotional or theurgical act. But within the Theocletian rite, we also see, for example, the prayer to the Blessed Lady, which, if anybody has seen me celebrate this liturgy, you know that this is an important part of the liturgy for me. I find it very, very moving. I find it very, very transformative. I find it something that has a lot of power and a lot of meaning to me personally. And this appeal to the Blessed Lady, to the Theotokos in particular, seems to me to be part of the magical operation of devotion or theurgy. In addition to that, we do also see the invocation of particular saints. So the invocation of the saints to assist us and to intercede on our behalf is also a kind of devotional work. Within the Theocletian form, there are long periods of silence. And I generally mention this before I even begin the celebration of the liturgy, just so everybody knows that I haven't, died or something like in the middle of the liturgy because I'm not saying anything for 3 minutes or something like that. But these silences are always an invitation to do the kind of mystical or contemplative or devotional work that ought to be part of our magical and esoteric practice. But there is one other aspect of the Theocletian rite in particular, the Theocletian form in particular, that I consider to be a kind of magical act, which is the credo, or the profession of faith. And I think that I'm going out a little bit on a limb here in talking about this as a magical act, because we know that in the exoteric churches, in a Catholic church or an Anglican church or an Orthodox church, there is always a profession of faith, a statement of what the community believes. But I think that within the context of the Apostolic Johannite Church, this takes on a different kind of character. That the explicit statement of a dedication to certain principles and certain ideas and a certain viewpoint regarding the world is itself a kind of magical act in which we commit ourselves in a vocal and verbal sort of way to a particular kind of practice. There is also the therapeutic aspect of magic or esoteric practice. That is to say that we use magical energy, we use the magnetic or electric fluids in order to try to affect spiritual or physical change in the celebrant, in the congregation, and those for whom we pray. And the prayer for particular intentions, I think, does something really extraordinary in channeling that kind of energy and that kind of power to a particular end, to a particular use. Magical healing, I think, is one of the most important effects of participation in the liturgy, both for ourselves and for others. The penitential rite and the confiteor are ways in which the community and the celebrant purify themselves and hope to heal themselves in profound ways in order to better serve the goals of the church and our spiritual lives. But also, as I said, the intentions for others are a way to make sure that energy is used in a positive sort of way. The Oblates, of course, keep a regular list of prayer intentions, and that, I think, is one of the most important jobs that order serves, to make sure that we have a central repository for those who could benefit from the kind of energetic healing that can be effected within the context of something like the liturgy. Of course, no discussion of esotericism or magical practice would be complete without talking about initiation. Initiation is the participation in certain kinds of rites that ultimately provides a transformative experience that we can undergo that changes on a core level who we are and how we approach the world. And ultimately, I think that the liturgy serves this purpose first and foremost, that you ought not to be the same person coming out of the liturgy than you were going in. I remember seeing a sort of billboard sign in front of a church once that expressed this, I think, very, very well. It said, "Come as you are, you won't leave as you were." And if that is in fact the case, then there is something magical that has happened within the context of the liturgy. As I said, the sacraments are often explicitly initiatory. The initiation of baptism, the initiation of confirmation, which I'm going to be talking about later this weekend, the Eucharist itself, and the holy orders all have an initiatory character. They place an indelible seal in one sense or another on those who receive them in order to change their lives and the way that they experience the world. So when we put those sacraments into the liturgy, and as I said, they are properly done within the context of the liturgy, we recognize that the liturgy itself has an initiatory character to it, that it removes us from the ordinary stream in order to set us on a path in which, through our own questing, we reach to something beyond ourselves. And there are aspects of the liturgy that are shared with a wide variety of initiatory rituals. The invocation of lineage. And this, of course, is very, very important within the holy orders understood within the context of apostolic succession. But when we recite those who have tread the path before us, and that's done in a couple of different ways. The litany of the sovereign pontiffs, the invocation of the various mystics and esotericists and practitioners who have done the kind of work that we hope to do, that demonstrates that we are connected to a chain that reaches beyond simply our ordinary lives and the ordinary communities that we form in our everyday lives, and instead connects us to something greater than ourselves, which is the conduit through which initiation flows. The narrative is also a part of many initiation rituals, giving you a history or story. And it even begins, Moses was initiated in Egypt. So we have an explicit reference to the fact of initiation within the context of the tradition in which we're working. And finally, there is the comment that we are renewed by the bread of life, that there is a qualitative transformation that takes place not just in the physical elements of the liturgy, but in ourselves in a profound and meaningful way. So we can see that there are all of these sort of magical elements, magical moments that take place within the context of the liturgy. And I would argue that these magical operations are not separate from the Mass or the liturgy, that they are the content of it. They are what's actually happening here. In an esoterically oriented organization like the AJC, we look to the meaning behind each symbolic act or statement or object. That nothing that is part of that liturgy ought to be extraneous or decorative or merely utilitarian, but rather each part of the activity that takes place within that sacred space is dedicated to a single purpose. And we, as a community of will, are able to effect change through the use of these words, these gestures, these objects. So when we look at any object that appears, for example, on either of the altars in the Theocletian form, each one ought to have a special symbolic, magical meaning. And actually one of the sort of most rewarding things that I've been able to do as a kind of ambassador for the Theocletian form is when I celebrate it for the first time for somebody new, that they often come up and they say, well, what's this thing? And why is there a giant sword? And what's this thing over here? And why do you do that? And why do you say this thing? And why do you not say anything? And when we look at all of those different kinds of symbols, it's really important, I think, to be able to say, this is what those things mean. This is what they do. This is why they're present. And if I ever get stumped, if somebody says, well, what's that doing there? And I go, oh God, I have no idea. What the hell is that thing doing there? Right? I've got to then begin to reconsider my own experience of that liturgy and reconsider that why that thing is there in a really sort of concrete way. Otherwise, we run the risk of falling into superstition. Some years ago, there was a fairly heated debate about something as simple as the order in which the archangelic candles were placed on the altar. And it was really important to all of us who were part of this discussion that we understood why we made the certain decisions that we did, why it goes in this particular order, why the air and fire candles are on one side and the water and earth candles are on the other side. And ultimately, I think we were able to understand that and to come to experience the meaning of those symbols more profoundly when we gave it some thought, when it became something that was an intentional, magical act, rather than just, well, that's how it's always been done. And I think that the real danger of superstition is going through the motions of a ritual, of a liturgy, of a practice, without a real understanding of what it is that we're doing and why we're doing that. When I say that the AJC is a community of practice, I'm not just talking about a group that gets together to say the same words together for an hour. And without wanting to criticize the exoteric churches, I worry that that is what the experience of church is for so many people. I come together with a bunch of people and we all call ourselves Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or Methodists or Baptists or Jews or Muslims or whatever it is, and we say the same things together. But that's not enough. There's got to be an effort of will behind it. We've got to allow ourselves to be transformed by and participate in the liturgy. And that ultimately is what forms a community. And that, more than anything else, is a magical act in which a group of individuals ceases to be merely an aggregate and becomes a whole. And when I talk about the celebrant turning his or her back on the congregation, that's not a gesture of distance. That is not a separation. That isn't saying that the celebrant is special or better than the congregation, doesn't deserve their attention. But rather, this is the moment where the congregant the congregation, and the celebrant most completely become a single community, serving a single purpose, using what I would call magic in order to transform the lives of each and every person in the room. So, with that, I'm hoping that there will be some questions. We have lots of time to take questions, and if you have questions about particular aspects of liturgy or anything like that, I'd be happy to entertain those now. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Yeah, Jonathan.
So, are there? So that was my first time yesterday sitting through the Declaration of Liturgy.
Sitting through, I think, is the appropriate description of that.
Experiencing. The icons that were on the table here for Christ,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Sacred Flame, are those part of local custom, or are those things that are explicit in the celebration of the Declaration?
They are part of the local custom, but it has been a regular practice, I think, wherever the Theocletian Rite is celebrated, that icons are part of that process, a part of that experience. I know that for myself at St. Michael's, I have a particular set of icons that are fixed. So I've got an image of St. John. I've got an image of John the theologian before the one like the Son of Man. I have images of the Holy Sophia. I have an image of Archangel Michael, and so on and so forth. And these icons become sort of windows/mirrors through which we can begin to have these kinds of magical experiences within the context of that liturgical practice. But it is not explicitly stated in the rubrics or anything like that, and nor are there particular icons that are mandated. So it's like nowhere does it say, well, you have to have an image of St. John, or you have to have an image of Sophia, or you have to have an image of the Baptist, or you have to have an image of the one like the Son of Man. So it's going to be unique to the particular location. In fact, where did Scott go? He wandered off somewhere. Because I'm not, and I ought to have, this is a mistake on my part, I didn't really take a moment to sort of drink in those particular icons and see what the particular representations were. And I think then I run the risk of that superstition. Oh, there are the icons there. Okay, good enough, right? Well, no, I should be looking at what exactly those represent and what kind of forces those are going to bring to bear in the ritual. So I'm glad that was brought up. Any other questions? Yeah, Jonathan, please.
One more.
Yeah.
This one's a pretty loaded question. So
Good. I like those ones. They have a tendency to go off.
So I was thinking about this morning, and you were talking about orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, and we're obviously talking about the content of magical practice within the framework of the liturgy. How does one reconcile some of the text selected from either the Old Testament or the New Testament of orthodoxy, in many cases for Trinitarian or Abrahamic faiths, which explicitly prohibit the practice or even conceptualization of magic, and then putting it into a Trinitarian concept with a magical execution? E.g., reading this passage from Judges or the book of Exodus,
right.
where a couple passages later, like, yep, those people should be stoned. By the way, here's the magical practice that we're going into, or their own. So.
This has been an ongoing discussion, and I think that the best way I have to answer that is to say what we oughtn't to do in this case, which is to just say, well, we're going to pick and choose the bits that we want, and we're not going to worry about that thing where it talks about prohibitions, for example, against magical practice explicitly, things like that. So I think we've got to be careful not to just treat Scripture as a salad bar where we take a little bit of what we want and we leave the things that we don't want behind. That we do have to try to integrate these things. We do have to try to make sense of them. And often I think what that requires is a kind of shift more in mindset than in hoping to change the scripture itself. I remember the first time Dr. Juliana Eimer encountered the credo, the statement of the profession of faith. She sort of shook her head a little bit, and she's like, I'm not sure about some of this stuff. And I said, well, what's important is that you be able to take that statement and give it meaning for yourself. And that requires a level of interpretation. And I don't think that to do so is to do violence to the text. I think that is to make use of the text for precisely the purposes for which it's intended, which is to guide and shape spiritual life. And so she literally went sort of line by line. So, well, can I think about this way? Well, yeah, sure, why not? Can I think about this way? Can I take this to mean this? And so she got to the end and said, okay, I'm comfortable with that. And so I think that there is a kind of practice involved there, where we don't dismiss these things out of hand, but we integrate them into our own experience of the world in order to understand what is the purpose that they serve for us. I think that the mistake of literalism is precisely to skip that step, right? To simply take it at face value. I think the mistake of sort of New Age syncretism is that we just ignore the bits we don't like, right? And I think that the idea of taking scripture and taking the tradition seriously involves some work. And it's not easy, and I don't think I have an easy answer for how one does that. But I think that the more we embrace the tradition as a whole, the easier it becomes to see the ways in which those seemingly contradictory or seemingly disparate elements can become part of that greater whole. So very long-winded, very bad answer to a really, really good question. So,
Thank you for your
Jonathan, yeah. The other Jonathan.
So obviously you talked about the Theocletian rite, and in your opinion, just being a little bit more explicitly magical.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that the more mainstream Eastern Rite, and maybe not to offend any of our brothers and sisters in Eastern Orthodoxy watching this, is more explicitly theurgical than a Western Rite, or?
My answer would be yes, but I'm going to couch that in very specific terms, which is that I think that says more about me and my approach to it than it does about the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom itself, right, or the Liturgy of St. Basil, or whatever it is. I certainly see esoteric elements more clearly within those liturgies. Whether it's in there or not, I'm not sure. I'd be loath to sort of project my own sort of attitudes and perspectives and interests and libidinal investments and commitments onto somebody else's liturgical practice. All that said, my simple answer is yes. Yeah, I think that those things are more present in Orthodox practice than they are in, say, certainly than they are in, say, what you see in the United Church of Christ, or, the UU, or the Presbyterian Church, or the Anglican Church, or even within the Catholic Mass. I would go so far just historically to say I see more of those elements in the Tridentine Rite than I do in the Novus Ordo. Right? I see more of those in the Novus Ordo than I do in the Book of Common Prayer. Right? But I'm not sure to what extent that's a reflection of my attitudes and my interests versus something that's inherently present in those liturgical practices. So I would always hedge I would always hedge that, because I don't have the authority to speak on behalf of those communities.
Of course.
Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, there were two things. One, the litany of sovereign pontiffs I always thought was interesting, and it kind of reminded me about being in the Blue Lodge. And so the lodge that I used to be in, they had a picture of all of the past grandmasters.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this always made me think of a sort of, in lack of a better term, an ancestor cult.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
it ties you in, so it's very cosmological. It ties you into a long list. Like, there's the lineage, it's right there, you can see it, or you can list it out. You can see their faces in that case, or in our case, we hear their names and we have their stories. What's interesting and magical about that is that it creates the individual's cosmology through time and from life into death. So it kind of creates...
Say more about that. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
It just creates like a sort of family or a lineage that carries through eons of time.
Yeah, it transcends the individual.
It sort of creates a road of people that carries you off into death and then become part of just because.
I particularly like that image of a road of people, right? Of that it's a pathway that's formed as pathways are by people treading them.
Right.
And so whether we're talking about the images of the Grand Masters or the past masters on the wall of the Masonic Lodge, or the altar of the past masters, and the recognition of the Golden Chain in a Martinist Lodge, or we're talking about the Litany of the Sovereign Pontiffs, or we're talking about the fathers, mothers, patriarchs, matriarchs, so on and so forth, that have tread the path before us in the liturgy. It's all about forming that, what we used to call the Golden Chain, right? That
it shouldn't be seen as, I try not to see it as being a formal thing that we do in the Mass just to do, that's long and boring and repetitive. But it should be intimate.
yeah.
It should be a personal connection.
Absolutely. And no, I think that's absolutely right. And if it just becomes, this thing that we do, that's superstition, right? That's practice without understanding, which is always sort of my definition of what it means to be superstition, is to do something without understanding why I'm doing it. So, to take, sort of ordinary superstitions, right? Right, if I crack a mirror, 7 years bad luck. Why? Right? And if you don't have a good answer, well, then don't worry about it. But if you've got a good answer for why that crack in that mirror means that somehow your luck is transformed, then it's no longer a superstition, it's a spiritual practice. So if reciting the Litany of the Sovereign Pontiffs is just, an opportunity to practice our French pronunciation, then, it doesn't really serve a magical purpose. But when it becomes a moment wherein we as individuals can recognize our participation in something greater than ourselves that extends not just geographically, but temporally, then it becomes something really, really powerful. Then it becomes something that is transformative. So I think you're absolutely right. And then you had a second point that you wanted to make as well?
Oh, yeah, our statement, the oath or whatever that we...
The credo, yeah.
Yeah. It kind of strikes me, I was just thinking, it just occurred to me today, so it's just a new idea to me, but it's sort of, you can think of it in terms of a magical oath, I'm going to do that, really think about it like that. But also, in terms of maps and cosmology.
Yeah.
It seems to be a bit of a vague map, possibly.
Let me tackle the first part first, because I think that you're absolutely spot on with that. That has the nature of the magical oath. And I wanted to mention that, and I'm not sure why I left it out, so I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's exactly what's going on there. Every initiation that I have undertaken involves an oath, a statement of something to which you are going to dedicate yourself. And it could be as simple as, I'm not going to blab about what I've just seen to everybody else, to I'm going to commit myself to certain kinds of practices. And I think that the credo, especially what we sometimes refer to as the philosophic credo, this long, extended statement of ideas in the Theocletian Rite, has that nature of binding us to a magical oath. I absolutely think that's right. And then the second was about forming a sort of cosmological map that gives us a way of looking at the universe in order to understand it from a particular standpoint. And as we always emphasize, maps are not territories, right? That it's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of experiencing these things, not how they are. And I think that particularly within the context of a church like the AJC, that's vitally, vitally important. The AJC is never going to tell you, this is how things are, and there are these archons, and they have these names, and there are these eons, and you've got to work through them this way, and there's this thing at the top, and there are these things down here. No, it says, well, you can look at it this way, and you can look at these structures, and that's one way to look at what is. And then when you turn this way, all of a sudden, you have a completely different way of looking at what is. And each one of those is an opportunity to experience the world in a particular way. And so when we recite that credo, what we're saying is, in this moment, here's the framework that we're going to use. Here's the way that we're going to experience the world for the purposes of celebrating this liturgy. It doesn't mean I'm absolutely committed to that as a statement of fact. I'm committing myself to a belief that this is an expression of what is. Not that it is what is, but it is an expression of how that phenomenologically demonstrates itself to me. So I think you're spot on both points. Your Eminence.
I just wanted to make a perhaps humorous connection talking about the lineage chain or the golden chain, being a path to take you somewhere. That there was also talking about Eastern liturgies and saints. I think it was John Chrysostom that said the road to hell was paved with the skulls of priests.
With the skulls of priests, yes.
Of course, that also means that the road...
Or the mitres of bishops.
Yeah, the road out of there is also paved with the exact.
I think that's right. I was expecting Dr. Kupperman to describe, the road paved with corpses, that's how we get there. That's later. Okay. Secret not pertaining to my grade, I think. Any other questions? Yeah, Dr. Kupperman.
Not so much a question, but continuing with this thought of the creed as cosmological. That creeds are often defining. This is who we are. And to me, knowing who you are implies knowing where you are. Giving one this cosmological sense that the creeds, especially religious creeds, that have this sort of horizontal, vertical ascent, lets me know where I am on the horizontal plane. It sort of places me within cosmology as well as connecting me to the past and the future.
I think that whenever we make a statement about what we believe, we are grounding ourselves at a particular place, in a particular time, in a particular relation. And I think that one of the strengths of that is that it allows us to experience other perspectives with a kind of security, with a kind of confidence. I always would joke about the most recent Pope Benedict, that the reason that he was able to be the first pope to pray at a mosque was because he precisely knew where he stood. He knew what he believed, and so praying at a mosque was no risk to him. There was no danger there. But if you don't really know where you stand, if you don't really know where you are, then every differing idea becomes a threat, becomes a danger. But so I think, as is so often the case, there are two extremes, right? There's the, I don't believe anything, I've got such an open mind, my brain falls out, in which every differing idea becomes a threat, becomes a danger. And then there is the hidebound, ossified belief that this is how things are and nothing else could ever possibly be true. And I think that the credo is sort of, you're describing it as locating us at a particular time and place. Splits that difference, finds that mean between those two extremes, that allows us to say, this is how I'm experiencing the world, and so a different experience of that world does not contradict where I am, because I know that I stand at this place in this time. And if you're standing there, that's not a danger to me, that's no risk to me. So I like the imagery of by understanding the vertical sort of conceptual ladder there that tells us where we stand on a range. So I think that the Credo really does, I would hope, serve that precisely that kind of purpose. Anything else anybody would like to add or ask? All right then. Thank you guys very, very much.